The summer of 1852 rolled through the low country like a fever. The air itself seemed to waver, thick, golden, and uneasy, as if the land was holding its breath. Along the Savannah River stood Riverwood Plantation, a place so breathtaking that travelers often stopped just to stare. White columns gleamed against the dusk, framed by oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. It looked peaceful, too peaceful. But those who worked its soil knew better. They knew that behind the facade of charm and prosperity, beauty often wore a mask. Riverwood belonged to Thomas and Eleanor Hargrave, among the wealthiest families in Chatham County. He was a man of discipline and punishment, she of grace and appearances. Together, they ruled Riverwood like a kingdom built on manners and misery. To outsiders, they were the picture of Southern gentility. But to the people in the fields, the enslaved men and women who breathed beneath that gentility, Riverwood was less a home than a well-dressed cage. And then, one July morning, it all stopped. The bells that marked the day's labor didn't ring. The wagons from the harbor never arrived. Smoke rose faintly from the chimneys, but no voices came from the veranda. At first, neighbors thought it was illness. Fevers were common that summer. But as the days stretched into weeks, an uneasy whisper began to travel down the dirt roads. Something's wrong at Riverwood. Still, the fields looked perfect. Cotton was picked, weighed, bundled. Horses were groomed. The routines never broke. Yet there was a silence that didn't belong, the kind that prickles your skin before your mind can explain why. When William Parker, an overseer from a nearby estate, finally rode over to check, what he found left him cold. The grand house stood untouched. The porch swept clean. Dinner plates still laid out on the table, candles burned halfway down, as if time itself had stopped halfway through a meal. And standing at the entrance was Solomon, the blacksmith. A tall, quiet man known for his calm. He greeted Parker with measured politeness and explained, in a tone that allowed no argument, that Master Hargrave had departed on business, leaving him in charge. For a moment, Parker almost laughed. An enslaved man claiming command over one of Georgia's most powerful estates? Impossible. But the look in Solomon's eyes, cold, still, almost prophetic, made laughter die in his throat. Parker left uneasy, spooked by something he couldn't name. He didn't know then that the silence at Riverwood wasn't emptiness. It was confinement. That beneath those shining floors, behind a wall of newly laid brick, something, or someone, was still breathing. And as dusk settled over the marsh that night, the crickets began their song again, the first sound after weeks of quiet. Even they, it seemed, sang carefully, as if afraid of what might be listening beneath the ground. Before his name became a whisper of fear, it was just another line in a ledger. Charleston, 1848. Male, approximately 30 years old. Literate. Skilled in carpentry and metalwork. A description written without a heartbeat, the kind of cold summary that could erase a man's life with a single pen stroke. That man was Solomon. He had once been a husband and a father. Sold away from his wife and children, their faces fading behind him as the ship drifted from the dock. Witnesses said he didn't cry, didn't beg, he just watched, with eyes that burned too quietly to forget. When he arrived at Riverwood Plantation, he carried no rebellion in his voice, no visible defiance. Just a silence so steady it made others uneasy. Thomas Hargrave valued efficiency above all else. He didn't care who a man had been, only what he could build, fix, or profit from. So he assigned Solomon to the forge, the beating heart of the plantation's machinery. There, under the hammer and smoke, Solomon repaired hinges, wagon wheels, locks, even the delicate rifles the master hunted with on Sundays. And he was good. Too good. Every weld was clean. Every hinge perfect. The man's craftsmanship bordered on artistry. Even Hargrave, who praised no one, once remarked with a smirk, "If you ever turn these skills against me, Solomon, I suppose I'd have only myself to blame." To which Solomon replied, calm, polite, chillingly soft, "Then I reckon you'd be right, sir." Nobody laughed after that. In those quiet years, something inside him was hardening, not with hate, but with design. He endured the whippings, the long nights in isolation, the small daily humiliations that were meant to break him. But instead of cracking, he calculated. Each punishment etched another line into a blueprint that only he could see. He learned more than blacksmithing at Riverwood. He learned routine, timing, weakness, the sound of the floorboards that creaked under Hargrave's boots, the way the cellar door closed just before supper, the rhythm of a house that thought itself eternal. And in the heat of the forge, while others saw only sparks and iron, Solomon saw something else, reflection. The way metal yields to fire, the way it can be shaped, bent, and still hold strength. Perhaps, he thought, men were not so different. By the time the calendar turned to 1852, Solomon had become indispensable to the estate. The master relied on him for every repair, every mechanism that kept Riverwood's order intact. But beneath that calm exterior, he was already building something else. Not rebellion, not revenge, but a kind of truth. A truth he intended to forge in iron. By day, Riverwood shimmered with charm, the hum of cicadas, the smell of magnolia blossoms, the faint laughter drifting from the veranda. But beneath that surface, life was measured not in beauty, but in fear. Every sunrise was a reminder: survive, obey, repeat. For those who toiled in the fields, routine meant safety. Predictability was armor. But for Solomon, routine was also revelation. Every bell that rang, every command shouted, every lash of the whip became data, pieces in a pattern he was slowly mapping. He watched how Thomas Hargrave moved through his world, always in control, always certain that power was his birthright. He watched Eleanor, her smile perfectly practiced as she served supper to guests while slaves stood silently behind her chair. And he watched the others, men and women who carried centuries of pain in their posture, but still found ways to sing under their breath when no one was listening. Solomon rarely spoke, yet people noticed him. There was something unsettling about the way he studied things, not people, but systems. Locks, hinges, gates, even the gears of the cotton press. He seemed to see the invisible skeleton of order that held the plantation together, and quietly took note of every weak joint. Some said he was dangerous. Others said he was strange. But the truth was simpler: he was patient. Late at night, when the plantation slept and the marsh winds whispered through the trees, Solomon would sit near the forge and stare into the coals. That orange glow, steady, pulsing, was his companion, his confidant. It was there, in that silence, that the first seeds of an idea began to take shape. It wasn't born out of sudden rage. It was born out of repetition, the 1,000 small humiliations that teach a man what power really looks like. He began to wonder, if control could be built, could it also be unbuilt? If cruelty could be structured, could justice be engineered the same way? No one saw the moment it shifted inside him, when endurance became design. But from that point forward, every day felt different. When he repaired a gate, he studied how it locked. When he forged a hinge, he thought about how it might close forever. To anyone else, it looked like diligence. To Solomon, it was rehearsal. And under the shade of the magnolia trees, where beauty and rot grew side by side, a quiet revolution was taking shape, not with fire or fury, but with patience. Because the greatest act of defiance, he had learned, was not to shout, but to plan. Every revolution begins somewhere: a whisper, a thought, a single spark. For Solomon, it began in the forge. At night, when the plantation slept and the moonlight licked the anvil, he worked alone. To anyone passing by, it was ordinary labor: repairing tools, mending chains, maintaining the machinery that kept Riverwood running. But under the hiss of hot metal, Solomon was creating something else entirely. He began with small pieces: hinges, brackets, iron rings. Functional, harmless things. But each one was measured with a precision that made no practical sense for simple repairs. These weren't spare parts. They were components. Pieces of something larger. The forge became his confessional. Every strike of the hammer was another heartbeat of a plan that had been building for years, patient, deliberate, inevitable. He shaped the metal as carefully as a man writes a letter, every weld carrying meaning. And the irony: the master provided the tools. Thomas Hargrave's greed had armed him. His obsession with efficiency gave Solomon access to everything he needed: raw iron, coal, and time. Even trust, in a twisted way. The blacksmith had learned long ago that the most dangerous weapon on a plantation wasn't a blade or a gun. It was belief, the master's belief that he was untouchable. So Solomon fed that belief. He obeyed perfectly, worked tirelessly, never raised his voice. To Hargrave, he was the model of discipline. To Solomon, it was camouflage. When he spoke to the others, the men and women who lived and bled under the same sun, he said little. But his silence began to carry a kind of gravity. Some whispered that he was planning something. Others feared even to think it. After all, hope was a dangerous thing. Still, a few helped. Quietly. A bricklayer here, a stable hand there. They didn't know the full plan, only fragments. That was the brilliance of it. Each person played a small part, and only Solomon saw the whole design. As weeks passed, a strange rhythm settled over Riverwood. Hammer by day, secrets by night. Beneath his hands, the iron took shape, doors that opened one way, bars that fit perfectly into grooves, locks that could close forever. And when the final piece cooled on the anvil, Solomon didn't smile. He simply stood there, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the forge. He had built something that would not burn, something that would outlive him. He wasn't forging rebellion. He was forging reflection, a mirror of the very system that had caged him. By the summer of 1852, the blueprint was complete. Riverwood was still beautiful on the surface, but under its floors, in the cool dark where no one looked, the architecture of vengeance waited, silent, perfect, and ready. At first, it seemed like nothing had happened. The sun still rose over the savanna marshes, and the mornings began as they always had, the clang of the bell, the slow march of tired feet toward the fields. But something was different in the air. Lighter, quieter, almost expectant. Then, one morning, the bell never rang. Thomas Hargrave, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children were nowhere to be found. No riders left the gates, no wagons rolled down the road to town. The grand plantation house stood immaculate, dinner plates still laid out, candles half burned, chairs neatly tucked beneath the table as if a meal had just paused mid-breath. Days passed. The neighboring estates sent word, then sent riders. No response. The enslaved kept working as if under invisible command, precise, mechanical, expressionless. They didn't sing, didn't speak. Their silence felt almost ritualistic. When William Parker, an overseer from a nearby property, finally rode to Riverwood, the sight unnerved him. Everything looked alive, but no one seemed human. The slaves worked in eerie coordination, their faces calm, their eyes averted. Parker dismounted, uneasy. The main house smelled faintly of wax and wood polish. No dust. No struggle. No sign of departure. On the dining table, a loaf of bread had hardened beside a half-drunk glass of wine. Upstairs, the beds were perfectly made. And there, at the bottom of the stairs, stood Solomon. He greeted Parker with the same calm, respectful tone he had always used. "Good morning, sir," he said evenly. "Master Hargrave has gone on business. He asked me to see that things run as usual." The words were polite. The eyes behind them were not. They were steady, dark, and certain, as if the man already knew how this conversation would end. Parker wanted to laugh, to scold him, to remind him of his place. But the sound caught in his throat. Something about the house, its stillness, its perfect order, felt wrong. He mumbled a goodbye and rode off faster than he came, the hooves of his horse thudding against the dirt like a heartbeat trying to escape. And so Riverwood remained, outwardly untouched, inwardly hollow. The cotton was still picked, the barn still cleaned, the accounts still balanced in neat handwriting that was not the master's. What no one yet understood was that the plantation was now running under a new kind of order, one forged in secret, one written not in ink or law, but in iron and will. For 3 long weeks, Riverwood performed life. But beneath its polished floors, behind a wall of freshly laid brick, the truth waited, breathing, starving, remembering. The masters of Riverwood hadn't disappeared. They were home. By the 3rd week, whispers had become dread. No letters, no sightings, no trace. Colonel James Hargrave, Thomas's brother, finally arrived from Charleston, furious and suspicious. He was a man used to command, and he wasn't about to let a plantation vanish into rumor. He brought soldiers, dogs, and the kind of authority that demanded answers. Within hours, Riverwood's fragile illusion began to crack. The colonel stormed through the main house, kicking open doors, shouting his brother's name. but the halls echoed only his own voice. The servants, when questioned, said little. A few murmured that the master had left on business. Others simply lowered their eyes and whispered, "Ask Solomon." So he did. Solomon stood by the forge as if waiting for the question. His hands were clean, his voice even. "I told Mr. Parker the same, sir. The master left me in charge." The colonel's patience snapped. He ordered the men to search every inch of the property, the barns, the smokehouse, the stables, even the wells. They found nothing, until one man, checking the foundation of the main house, noticed something off, a section of brickwork that looked too new, the mortar still pale against the older stone. When they pried at it, the first few bricks came loose easily. Then the air changed. A wave of wrought and iron rolled out, thick and heavy, as if the earth itself exhaled a secret. The men gagged, their lanterns trembling. The colonel pressed forward, shouting for light. Behind the wall was a narrow passage, sealed tight. They crawled inside. What they found beneath Riverwood was no cellar, it was a tomb of design. Iron cages, 5 in total, each one fitted with precision no farmer could have built. The welds were clean, the locks seamless. Inside lay the remains of Thomas Hargrave, Eleanor, and their 3 children, twisted, starved, reduced to quiet ruin. The men froze. Some turned away. Others wept. The colonel fell to his knees, screaming his brother's name until his voice broke. But even he understood, this was no accident. Every bar, every hinge, every measurement spoke of intention. One of the soldiers whispered, "Who could have done this?" And though no one answered, every gaze drifted toward the door, toward the forge. Later, in his journal, Sheriff Thomas Blackwood would write a single line that history would never forget. "This is not murder. This is message." That night, the plantation erupted. Fear, rage, disbelief. But Solomon was gone. Vanished like smoke from a quenched flame. The next morning, when the sun rose over Riverwood, it touched a house that looked the same as before. White columns, polished floors, perfect order. But underneath, in the hollow where iron once gleamed, silence had a different weight now. The kind that doesn't wait for discovery. The kind that remembers. When the story of Riverwood began to spread through Georgia's plantations, it carried like a fever. But this was no simple tale of rebellion. What terrified the South wasn't the death of the Hargrave family, it was the design of it. Because what Solomon had built wasn't chaos. It was architecture. Each cage measured to precise proportions, forcing the body into positions of unending discomfort, unable to stand, unable to lie flat. A geometry of suffering. The same geometry the slave ships had once imposed on men like him. It wasn't murder for revenge. It was a reflection. The more the investigators studied the ironwork, the more they understood. Every joint, every hinge, every latch was crafted with purpose. This wasn't a blacksmith's rage. It was a philosopher's diagram, drawn in steel. Sheriff Blackwood's private notes, later sealed by the courts, described it this way. Each mechanism is a sermon in metal. The crime is moral, not mechanical. To the white elite, that thought was unbearable. An enslaved man, not only intelligent, but deliberate. Educated enough to write his vengeance into physics itself. They could accept rebellion. They could even accept brutality. But not intellect. Not that kind of control. In the weeks that followed, officials tried to frame the act as madness, a fit of rage, an animal turning on its master. But those who'd seen the craftsmanship knew better. Solomon had built a mirror, and forced the masters to look. Imagine it, the Hargraves, trapped beneath the same house they once ruled, listening to life continue above them. The sound of footsteps. The creak of chairs. The faint ring of a hammer from the forge. They would have heard it all, the same noises once made by the people they owned. And in those 2 weeks before death came, they finally understood what it meant to be unseen. Among the few surviving documents attributed to Solomon, smuggled letters, half-burned diagrams, one line stands out, written in careful script. To understand justice, one must feel the shape of chains. Scholars later called it the language of iron. But to those living through 1852, it was nothing less than blasphemy, a complete inversion of the world they believed God himself had ordained. That's why the story couldn't be printed, couldn't be taught, couldn't even be spoken above a whisper. Because what Solomon had done was not simply kill. He had taught. He had turned vengeance into instruction. And that, more than the bodies beneath the house, was what the South feared most. Because once a man like Solomon exists, even buried, the idea of him never dies. In the weeks after Riverwood was uncovered, fear spread faster than any truth. No newspapers printed it. No officials spoke of it. But everyone knew. Word slipped through kitchens, between quarters, across the marsh roads, whispered in trembling voices after sundown. The masters called it the Riverwood affair. The enslaved called it something else entirely, the day the earth spoke back. Plantation owners began sleeping with pistols under their pillows. They locked their workshops, forbade the teaching of trades like blacksmithing and carpentry. Even the sound of hammering iron began to draw suspicion, as if the echo of Solomon's forge still haunted every plantation in Georgia. In Savannah, merchants started selling reinforced locks and new steel shutters, while pastors filled their pulpits with sermons about divine order and obedience. "Do not listen to the whispers," they warned. "The Lord does not forgive defiance." But the very need for those sermons betrayed the panic beneath them. Because deep down, they all understood, Riverwood had changed something fundamental. It wasn't just a story of murder. It was proof that control could be reversed, that fear could move both ways. Every time a master gave an order and noticed the slightest pause before obedience, that hesitation burned like acid. Letters from that autumn still survive in private archives. One planter wrote, "Even as I dine, I feel watched by the people who serve the food. There is something different in their silence, a thought I dare not name." For the enslaved, silence became power. A shared secret, unspoken but understood. They didn't celebrate, didn't revolt. They simply carried on, but slower, more deliberate, as if each movement was a choice, not a command. And that terrified the world that had built itself on ownership. By the following year, local lawmakers rushed to rewrite policy. New restrictions were passed. No enslaved person could work metal without direct supervision, no more literacy training, no more independent trades. The entire structure of slavery began to tighten, not out of strength, but out of fear. Still, the story wouldn't die. It lingered in whispers, warped by retelling. Some claimed Solomon had escaped to the swamps, others that he walked the night roads, a hammer in his hand and a song no one could hear. But the truth was quieter, far more haunting. Solomon didn't need to be seen to be remembered. His name had become an idea, a presence that lived in the silence itself. And when the wind swept across the fields at dusk, stirring the cotton like waves, it seemed to carry a question the South couldn't answer. What happens when the enslaved stop fearing the masters, and the masters start fearing the enslaved? That question hung in the air long after the fires of Riverwood went cold. A century passed, and Riverwood's name faded from polite conversation. The land was sold, renamed, and later parceled off. History, as it often does, chose silence over memory. Textbooks skipped the year 1852. The Hargrave family's death became a vague incident. Solomon's name was erased completely. But history has a way of leaking through the cracks. In the summer of 1963, a renovation crew at the old Chatham County Courthouse stumbled on a row of sealed boxes buried behind a false wall. The labels read, "Case files are .1852, administrative irregularities." Inside were Sheriff Blackwood's notes, coroner's records, and a set of sketches, diagrams of cages, written in handwriting that didn't match any official report. The discovery caused brief chaos. Archivists debated what to do, while local officials scrambled to downplay it. But the story couldn't be hidden again. Scholars from Howard and Emory examined the papers and confirmed what had long been whispered: the Riverwood massacre wasn't folklore. It was fact. Among the files were letters between Sheriff Blackwood and his wife, written after the investigation. In one, he confessed, "I no longer see the enslaved faces in the fields as before. I see them now as mirrors in which our sins are made visible." That line would change everything. Soon after, historians began piecing together Solomon's life, from Charleston ledgers to property sales to the discovery of an unmarked tin box unearthed in 1966 near the Riverwood site. Inside were fragments of writing, diagrams, and one haunting phrase repeated again and again: "Let them know the weight of silence." The paper suggested Solomon's vision had been broader, not a single act, but the beginning of a pattern, a message meant to echo far beyond one plantation. His design wasn't rebellion. It was reflection, a moral inversion of the entire system that had built the South's wealth. But just as interest peaked, the research began to vanish. A lab fire destroyed the original negatives of the documents. Dr. Margaret Carver, who'd been preparing a study on psychological resistance in slave societies, withdrew from public life after her office was vandalized. Across the state, anyone who tried to publish on Riverwood began to encounter strange misfortunes. Files misplaced. Research grants revoked. Academic journals rejecting papers without explanation. One colleague recalled visiting Dr. Carver's office days before she vanished from public life. The words, "Let it rest," had been smeared across her door in charcoal. Still, not everyone obeyed the warning. In 1968, historian Thomas Mitchell uncovered Sheriff Blackwood's lost journal. He transcribed every line by hand and noticed something chilling, entries written after the official investigation had closed. In one, Blackwood wrote, "The true horror is not what Solomon did, but what he showed us, that mastery is an illusion sustained only by belief." Mitchell tried to publish his findings, but before the manuscript reached print, he was found dead in his home. The cause was ruled an accident. The journal disappeared again. By the time the 1970s arrived, Riverwood had become more legend than record. Locals called the site the Quiet Ground. Construction crews refused to work there, claiming their equipment failed for no reason, that shadows moved through the trees at dusk. And yet, beneath the superstition, the truth endured. The records that survived, the diagrams, the letters, the fragments of Solomon's writing, revealed a man who wasn't a monster or a myth, but something far more unsettling, a thinker. A craftsman who understood power as a mechanism and sought to rebuild it from the inside out. His words, written in faint, shaking ink, still echo through the archives. Freedom exists first in the mind. The body may be chained, but thought is the first escape. That single sentence reframed everything historians thought they knew about slave resistance. It wasn't just rebellion through fire or flight, it was rebellion through intellect, through design, through patience. And perhaps that was what frightened people most. Because if Solomon could think that way in 1852, it meant he hadn't been the only one. By the early 2000s, a small bronze plaque appeared near the edge of the property. It reads simply, "On this land once stood a plantation of local significance." No mention of Solomon. No mention of the cages. Just another layer of silence covering the truth. But if you stood there at dusk, when the air was still and the light went gold, locals swore you could hear it, a faint ringing beneath the earth, like metal cooling after the fire. Riverwood might have been forgotten by history, but history, it seemed, had not forgotten Riverwood. Today, the land where Riverwood once stood looks ordinary. A quiet stretch of suburb outside Savannah. Paved streets where children ride their bikes. Houses painted in soft colors, gardens lined with magnolia trees. To the untrained eye, it's peaceful, maybe even beautiful. But the ground remembers. Walk there at dusk, when the air grows heavy and the cicadas hum low, and you might feel it, a faint vibration beneath your feet, as though the earth itself is breathing. Locals say it's the old iron, the echo of a forge long gone cold. No plaque marks the real spot. The official one sits a mile down the road, sterile and vague. Yet for those who know the story, Riverwood's silence hums louder than any monument ever could. Because Solomon's legacy was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to haunt. When historians finally unearthed the forgotten graves in 1969, 7 bodies lay in the soil, the Hargraves, and the man who had caged them. Solomon's grave was unmarked. At the edge of the Hargrave plot, an iron post stands alone. Some say it marks his resting place. Others say it's a warning. Perhaps it's both. But the true legacy of Riverwood doesn't lie beneath that earth. It lives in the questions Solomon forced the world to face. What is justice when it begins to look like vengeance? What happens when the oppressed become the mirror of the oppressor? And what does it mean when a man, stripped of everything, uses the very tools of his enslavement to build a lesson the world still refuses to learn? Dr. Thomas Mitchell once wrote, shortly before his mysterious death, Solomon did not rebel against humanity. He imitated it. And in that imitation, he revealed its sickness. That is perhaps the truest horror of Riverwood, not the cages, not the deaths, but the reflection. Solomon didn't simply punish his masters. He made them live their own philosophy until it consumed them. His vengeance wasn't chaos. It was comprehension, a cruel, precise symmetry that turned morality inside out. And maybe that's why history buried him twice, once beneath brick and again beneath silence. Because Solomon's story doesn't let us look away. It forces us to confront the truth that cruelty, once taught, can be learned too well. The forge where he once worked is gone. The plantation house has crumbled. Yet the echo remains, the faint sound of hammer against steel, carried through time like a heartbeat that refuses to fade. Because some stories don't die. They wait. Beneath our feet, beneath our comfort, whispering through iron and soil. The past is not gone. It's only buried.